Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Before we start the webinar, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to get ready and log in. Whilst this is taking place, it would be good to get a sense of your coverage and perspectives on ESG more broadly, and to help with this, we have a couple of initial poll questions with another one to follow a bit later on. In the meantime, thank you for joining our carbon neutral webinar for what we hope will be a highly interactive and engaging discussion on all things ESG related, and hopefully more fun than the King's speech today. SDR, SFDR, key points from a reg compliance perspective, practical implementation considerations, what we are seeing in the market, and how Beauville, Newgate and Treaty can deliver tailored solutions to meet your individual requirements. Our aim is to leave you in a better place knowledge-wise, with more answers than questions, and increased confidence on what you need to be thinking about next and when to action. A couple of quick housekeeping points. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll aim to get that out to everyone as soon as possible, alongside any other materials used in today's session. You can submit questions at any point during today's session. We've dedicated some time at the end to pick up as many of those as possible. Finally, once we close today's session, please do hang around for 30 seconds to complete our short survey. We'd love to hear about what you thought of today's session and other areas you'd like us to cover in the future. Before we dive in, we now should hopefully have the results from the initial poll questions. Okay, that's an interesting mix there, but hopefully as we expected. To help navigate us on this journey, I'm delighted to be joined by Abby Riley, Practice Lead from Beauville Newgate, who specialise in regulatory advisory services across the asset management industry and are now part of the wider Accorian Group, and Hatim, co-founder and CEO of Treaty, Accorian's strategic ESG partner. Abby, to start with, can I ask you to take us through the background to SDR and SFDR, really focusing on regulatory compliance requirements, timelines, key considerations, and learning so far?
Sure, David, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start with SDR because it is the newer of the two regimes and perhaps less known as a result. I'm not going to go through each of these because my following slides will go into a little bit more detail about what they mean, but some key dates. First up, 31st of May, already gone, the anti-greenwashing rules have come into force and they apply to all regulated firms in the UK regardless of their type and regardless of their product. Big milestone at the end of July, which is when firms can begin to use labels for their products in respect of sustainability. And then at the end of this year, for people who are not going to use labels but want to market products to retail, the naming and marketing rules come in. Then a year on from those labels being applicable, ongoing product level disclosures will come about, and then there are some entity disclosures following on from there. So let's just remind ourselves, if we can, of who is in scope of the SDR and what products. So in terms of firms, they are UK AFIMs, both small and full scope, and UK UCITS Mancos and indirectly their sub-managers and distributors of those products. And in-scope products are UK AIFs and UCITS, and they are products offered to both retail and institutional investors. This is not a purely retail initiative, although there are some elements of the rules that are only applicable for retail, and I'll explain those as we go along. Now, in the timeline, there was mention of a consultation paper which closed mid-June around extending SDR to portfolio managers, so discretionary managers, wealth managers, etc. That consultation is closed, but we are yet to see any policy statement. And in fact, the smart money says that that policy statement is likely to be delayed, and indeed the proposed implementation subsequently delayed. So we're not expecting portfolio managers to come into scope until mid next year. And as for overseas funds, a number of you, of course, will be managing those. We are awaiting consultation on those. So if we move forward and have a look at slicing and dicing the key requirements by different type. So as I've mentioned, firms that are going to use product labels as at the 31st of July, they will need to consider consumer-facing disclosures for retail investors and pre-contractual product disclosures at the time of applying for the label. For those who are going to use sustainability terms without a label and market towards retail, they will need to be cognizant of the naming and marketing rules, consumer-facing disclosures, pre-contractual product disclosures as at towards the end of this year. Distributors need to be aware that they have obligations in respect of labelled funds, that they need to make sure that the appropriate labels and disclosures are available to the investors that they distribute to. And importantly, if they are going to be marketing overseas funds who are not part of the regime, there is a specific notice they need to produce as at 2nd of December to inform investors of that fact. And then we've got dates coming in for the larger asset managers around entity level disclosures end of next year and the following year. Importantly, though, as I mentioned up front, for all firms, the general anti-greenwashing rule, regardless of investor type, is already in. So you may not use green terminology that you cannot substantiate. So let's have a look at what that anti-greenwashing rule says. So any reference to the sustainability characteristics of a product or service must be consistent with those characteristics. What does that mean? Well, you need to be able to prove that you do what you say on the tin. And the overarching requirement is that it's fair, clear, and not misleading, so that you do not claim green credentials that you cannot substantiate. Our recommendation here is that all firms should be looking at their client communications, their websites, and to ensure that they are not misusing a list of terms that's really quite long, including obviously sustainable, sustainability, green, Paris aligned, etc. If we move on and look at the next commentary, which is around the actual labels themselves. So these are the labels that firms can apply to their products as at the end of July. And there are 4 labels. There is impact, which is applicable to a product or fund that sets out to achieve a predefined positive measurable impact in terms of environmental or social considerations. Improvers, so that is where the assets have the potential to improve environmental, social sustainability over time, so so-called transition assets. Focus, where there is an environmental or social focus within the assets, although there doesn't necessarily need to be a positive impact. And then mixed goals, which was introduced post-consultation because lots of firms said that we have clients that would like to have a mixture of those different types of sustainable goals. In all cases, interestingly, again, this was a change from the original consultation where it was only in respect of the impact label, but now for all cases, 70% of the assets within the fund need to be aligned with the label. So if we look at the next slide, we're talking a little about what the qualifying criteria are. So what do you need to be concerned with? Well, originally there was issues around whether one needed to use some kind of external benchmark, whether there was going to be the UK taxonomy to mirror the EU taxonomy. In fact, where we've ended up is that there needs to be reference to a robust evidence-based standard. Now, that standard can be an internal benchmark or internal standard, but it does need to be independently verified. There needs to be focus on material negative outcomes. So where you are pursuing a sustainable objective. If there are negative outcomes as a result, those need to be disclosed. And importantly, there need to be key performance indicators to measure progress against the sustainability objective. Appropriate resources, governance, and organizational arrangements need to be put in place to evidence these criteria. And importantly, again, there needs to be an investor stewardship strategy and resources to support it. And that stewardship strategy is expected for each of the labels, not merely the improvers one, which was the original consultation point. So if we have a look now at the next slide, please. And this is the naming and marketing rules. Now, please be clear that these are in relation to funds that are being marketed to retail only. So the first point is around product naming. If you are marketing a fund to retail investors which does not have a label, where you haven't applied for a label, you may not use in the title of the fund the terms sustainable, sustainability, or impact. So you are required to go for a label if you want to use those terms in the naming convention. You may, however, use other terms such as responsible or green, but anyone that does that are effectively caught by the similar disclosure obligations as if you had gone for a label. So you would still need to produce consumer-facing, pre-contractual and ongoing KPIs and reporting requirements. You have to, if you are going to use these terms and not have a label, publish a statement to clarify that you don't have a label and the reasons why not. Marketing is slightly less draconian in that you may use those three special terms in your marketing literature, that you just can't use them in the title. But again, where you do use so-called ESG terminology in your marketing, you will, where you're marketing to retail, have to comply with the disclosure regime. Now, this, as I say, does not apply to funds that are merely being marketed to professional investors. However, FCA have said they want firms to bear in mind the anti-greenwashing rules. And obviously, they would expect funds that are being directed towards professional investors to still comply with those requirements. If we look at the next slide, then please. What are the consumer-facing disclosures? So these are special disclosures for retail investors. Fairly understandably, what is the label? What is the fund's objective? If it's not labeled and you're using these sustainability-related terms, you need to have, as I've said, an explanation of why you haven't applied the label. There needs, in either case, whether labeled or otherwise, to be a clear, concise disclosure around your investment policy and strategy. And then there's ongoing reporting requirements and metrics and KPIs, which need to be put in a prominent place, largely your website with hard copies available. And these must be reviewed annually and updated to show the progress one is making either towards the sustainability objective of your labeled fund or to provide evidence of following the investment strategy that you originally disclosed. If we look at the other ongoing product sustainability disclosures, which apply to all investors, they're the pre-contractual ones. So those are required from the date the label is first used, and then ongoing, so starting from 12 months from the date that the label is used. The information to be disclosed is all of that is relevant to show, evidence, substantiate that you have followed the qualifying criteria for the labels that you are using. If we go to the next slide, please. So entity level disclosures coming in at the end of 2025 for the largest asset managers and the following year for a different selection. For those of you who are aware of the climate change disclosures, it's a similar principle of 4 pillars around your entity disclosures, which are all around governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. If we go to the next slide then, please. A little word on SFDR. I'm sure you're all very much aware of the requirements because they have been in place since 2021 for level 1 regulations and 2022 for the mandatory statements that needed to be made in respect of Article 8 and 9 products. The aim was to try and create transparency and clarity for investors, specifically around principal adverse impacts. And it was very much focused on a disclosure rather than label. So it's all about providing appropriate information to investors so they could understand the type of fund that they were investing in. So if we look quickly at the different buckets under SFDR, there's the Article 6, which basically says there is no integration of ESG consideration into the investment decision-making process at all. If we leap across to Article 9, this is, impact, products that have sustainable investments as their core objective. Article 8 is the one in the middle. Now, unfortunately, what seems to have happened is when it came to level 2 disclosures, Article 9 proved very difficult for a lot of firms to evidence effectively. And so we've seen a movement across back into Article 8. We've similarly seen people starting in Article 6 and through perhaps investor pressure, feeling they have to make some sort of green claim. So they've gone into Article 8. So what's happened is Article 8, unfortunately, has become rather a large green sludge bucket, which isn't really achieving what the regulators were trying to achieve, which is clarity and transparency. So you've got a very broad range of funds following substantially different objectives within that particular article. Now, this is the current situation. This is still live, and you still have to make the appropriate disclosures under Article 8 and 9, but there is movement. So if we have a little look where the EU are going. So they are moving away from the disclosure-led regime of Article 8 and 9, and they are looking at introducing product categories. And if you look at them, they are remarkably similar to the categories that have been introduced by FCA. So I think FCA are probably feeling quite smug about that. So there is alignment between improvers, impact, focus. There is implied alignment around mixed goals. The only outlier is the product category C, where under SFDR, if you are putting any kind of sort of negative filter in your fund, you will still be allowed to apply for a product category, whereas that is not within the SDR, where there is a specific sustainability objective is required. It's not just negative filtering. So I hope that's a whistle-stop tour of the regulatory requirements. David, are there any questions that have arisen at this point that you feel that we ought to cover off?
Yes, thanks, Abby. That was very helpful. Yes, we've had a couple from the floor already. So if I just read those out for the benefit of the audience, and then obviously you can actually sort of give your view. The first one is will the notice for overseas firms apply to overseas AIFM marketing funds via Article 42 AFMD themselves rather than via a UK distributor? I assume not, but grateful if you could confirm.
No, the requirement, it will be on a UK distributor. So someone, a wealth manager or someone based in the UK selling to retail, I should have made that clear, an overseas fund, they need to specifically state that it's an overseas fund and therefore not subject to SDR.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Abby, for that clarification. And then second question, can the sustainability terms be used for overseas funds without a label? The warning is used.
FCA have been rather draconian around not allowing people to opt in to the regime. So we've had a number of clients who don't meet the definitions in terms of in-scope products who've said nevertheless they would like to use a label, and they've been firmly told no. If they're obviously we're awaiting a consultation on overseas funds, but overseas funds at this point cannot adopt a label on a voluntary basis. It's only within the regime if at the moment in the UK.
Okay, that's good to know. Hatim, I think you're going to take us through the ESG reporting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, David, and thanks, Abby, for providing the overview of both these disclosure regimes, which are of course increasingly driving a lot of the conversations that we are having at Treaty with different investment firms, different fund managers on how they're setting up the ESG reporting, because like we've discussed many times before, while the labels and the definitions are very important to understand, the only real way that these can be substantiated is when there is a real system behind that supports and proves the impact with actual data. So the basic approach that we always encourage our clients to adopt and to look at this space, which is emerging very quickly, is to draw an analogy with the financial reporting flows that most funds already have, right? You have different assets and different portfolios, and there is always a system in place to collect that information, then compile it, validate it, work on it, and then create your reports. And in many ways, you can think of the ESG reporting flows as being developed in a way that will mirror this, and just that the actual content and the metrics and the data points collected will be different, but the flows and the processes are going to be similar. And it's best to think of this as a space which will eventually come to be a part of most financial reporting organizations or most accounting organizations. Then coming to the second question of what is the right approach? Is this something that can be done just internally with your existing setup, or is there a need for external service providers or tooling and things like that? And before I even get into the flows themselves and have a slide to share on what these flows entail, I think the key consideration that we find in the market on whether to do this internally or externally with, let's say, a provider such as us, is there are two important dimensions to consider. The first is the size of the portfolio. If you have, let's say, less than 10 assets, and you are not really looking at too many impact data points or too many ESG data points, it is possible perhaps to do it on an Excel sheet. But we find that as soon as the number of assets goes beyond 20, 30, let's say you have 100 assets, in our experience, we have not seen any of those systems work effectively. Again, just applying the financial methodology, at how many underlying assets can you actually work with? Or the other dimension that needs to be considered is, the depth of impact data, the depth of ESG information that it needs to be collected. So even if you have 10 assets, but you need to collect 100 data points per asset, again, it becomes unviable for you to do that through a manual or or let's say a spreadsheet-based setup. So if you are further along in either of these axes, if your portfolio size is large, or if you are looking at, let's say, one of the labels under the SDR regime, which would require to substantiate quite a few different areas, our recommendation is that you look at some way to formalize this process. And of course, I'm clearly biased in saying this, but the best way to do it is to work with a formal software tool, or at least have something that ensures the robustness and integrity of data. Because that's the key thing here. It needs to be taken at par with the same data quality as you ensure financial information needs to be ensured over here. Maybe I'll give a bit of an insight on what these processes normally look like, and then we can move on more to an open conversation. So if we have the slide come up. So typically, when we do any mandate with any of our clients, we start by just setting up the framework. And this is, the part where you would typically be speaking to somebody like Abby or one of our colleagues at Bowell Newgate, defining, not only what regime you want to kind of work with, but within that regime, what would constitute appropriate metrics, targets, things like that. Of course, you would need a lot of ESG and impact expertise to define these as well. But that is really the first step, defining that framework and understanding how you wish to apply that to the portfolio. Based on that, somebody like Treaty can set up the entire data collection and validation flow, sending out the questionnaires, when the responses come back, validating it against different sources or methodologies, resolving queries that come up. These are all things that somebody like us can do. Oftentimes, we see that there's a lot of data gaps. And that's one of the current challenges in the market. We expect it is going to remain there for the next few years because this is a field in its nascency. So for that period, one way to solve that problem of data gaps is by using proxies and estimations. And again, somebody like Treaty can provide those. You have to be a little sharp on where you can use proxies and where you cannot. It has to essentially serve the regime or the framework that you have adopted, and in some cases it would make sense. But of course, that is a bit of a nuance that needs to be answered in a case-by-case basis. And then finally, once all the data is in, then you would actually set up the reports and annexes or any other kind of template that you would like to spread out this information to. There are many situations we have seen that different limited partners or different stakeholders request separate kind of data points and have therefore separate dashboards. Or for example, in the stewardship question point that Abby mentioned previously, a lot of organizations like to have individual kind of growth pathways for their own companies and want to track how those organizations are evolving in terms of their own targets. So all of those things can also be built in, again, in a tool like Treaty, but of course, that needs to be defined case by case on how somebody wants to approach it. And so that's the overall journey. And of course, I'm happy to take questions and share more insights as we proceed with this conversation.
Thank you, Hatim. That was really helpful. Before we get to the additional sort of Q&A session, we do have a quick poll sort of question for everyone. So this is very much around where you are in your ESG reporting journey. And whilst we're waiting for that to come in, we have had a couple more online questions. So Abby, if I start with you initially, has there been any clarity on whether in-scope SDR label applications that are still in flight by 2nd of December, when the naming and marketing rules come into force, will be in scope of the naming and marketing rules or not? This is something which the FCA has yet to confirm on multiple occasions, despite being a large risk for firms.
Unfortunately, no, that is the position at the moment, that we don't know. And it is something that we've raised with FCA, because if people are willing and able to apply for labels, and if they are not, the permission has somehow not been granted, it seems rather unfair that they would have to run two regimes in parallel. But unfortunately, that is a matter still to be clarified with the regulator.
Okay, thanks, Abby, for those insights. Another question, how will the 70% figure be managed? Is it effectively constant monitoring? Presumably a level of pragmatism is needed if a fund temporarily dips below the 70% threshold.
I think it's the same as with any other regulation which requires some sort of concentration percentage. You'll have a soft limit and a hard limit. So presumably people will put a soft limit of 75 in place and start monitoring significantly below that. And it's obviously in the private asset sphere. If you suddenly discover that there, unfortunately, some sort of toxic incident has happened in respect of an asset that otherwise was meeting your objective, you cannot, it is unreasonable to suddenly, what are you supposed to do, just sell it? You could potentially sell it at a massive discount, which would affect the overall performance of the fund, and that wouldn't be appropriate for investors. So there must be some soft landings here, and I think the key is to have a plan, to have, as Hatim was saying, clear sort of actions, metrics, what you've done about it, so that it is transparent and applicable. And although the unexpected item in baggage area, as I called it, provision, which was FCA sort of, you need to notify if there's been an unexpected event or investment, has gone, which people are pleased about, because that could end up with a sort of multiple reporting obligations. Nevertheless, there is the concept that something untoward happens, and one needs to have a plan to deal with it, rather than being into a forced sale situation, which would be unfair, as I say, to investors.
No, thanks, Abby. And I think, you're right. It sort of echoes the approach around sort of advertent breaches, market movements, the intent, and as you say, the investor impact in terms of any sort of forced sort of transactions. The questions are coming in thick and fast, so I've got a couple more sort of online ones before we get to some other ones we have. Do you think it is likely, and if so, what timescale, that life and pension wrap funds will be included in the SDR?
I mean, ultimately, I think the direction of travel is that everything will be included, but they've started with funds, probably because it is easier to have a labelled fund, because funds are held within a sort of overall kind of portfolio approach. So someone can choose to have 10% of their portfolio in an ESG friendly fund, and they can go. So it lends itself to, as the sort of guinea pig for the regime, if you like. Life and pensions are by nature much more complicated, as there are other considerations. And obviously, there is some debate, particularly in the US, about this sort of tension between fiduciary duty and obligations in respect of the performance, frankly, of investments, and I call it the conflict between sort of passion and caring for the planet and your money and your purse. So planet versus purse, and it's much more difficult in the life and pension sphere to be sort of dictate that. But I think it's coming, but I think they will have to think very carefully. As I think they've already been given pause to think by the feedback that they've got from the portfolio managers on that consultation, where they hadn't necessarily thought it through. And I think they all need to adapt, and then they'll hopefully learn the lessons from that adaptation to then go and look at life insurance. I think and pensions, it's harder. So I think funds are the first wave, because it is more straightforward to see how it can be applied.
No, thanks, Abby. Couple more online questions. What will be the ongoing disclosure requirements for the SDR labels?
They will be proving, if you like, how you're fulfilling the sustainability objective of the fund. So the key is, what is the sustainability objective of the fund? What is the strategy? What are your key performance indicators? And so the reporting will need to show that you continue to follow that strategy. And that's where obviously Hatim's team comes in, because they will be able to then feed the metrics behind that to say, yes, to pluck something out of the air. We've got a social fund where the 70% of the assets are focused towards providing alleviation of poverty by social housing, for example, or whatever it may be. And so you need to actually show in your metrics that this is the reports that you're going to send out, that you are indeed doing, as I said, what you say on the tin. So I think the pre-contractual disclosures will be important, because what you'll want to do is link your reporting to those disclosures. So at all times, there can be no allegation that you're being unfair or unclear, because you're reporting on what you enticed your investor into investing in.
Thanks, Abby. Another question, I think this links to a general point regarding sort of market preparedness for SDR in the UK, both on the asset management side and obviously on the regulatory approval side. So the question here is, other than the AEW Impact Fund, which recently obtained approval from the FCA to use an impact label, are you aware of any other funds, in particular broad-based funds, which have obtained approval from the FCA to use labels?
I'm not, the sort of the kind of the feedback is slightly concerning in this respect, because we're being told that there's been quite a lot of rejections, and not just single, but multiple rejections. So sort of ping pong between FCA and even some of the sort of larger and more sophisticated asset managers who have sort of ESG teams. So there does seem, unfortunately, to be a bit of a gap between what FCA expect and what the market are showing them. And the feedback I got was that fund objectives is the problem, that they are FCA are rejecting them to be sort of insufficiently granular, and the accompanying processes. So what I was describing earlier around also, how have you adapted your investment process? What are your metrics? What am I, as the investment committee, seeing? How are you monitoring it? What is your stewardship strategy? How do you monitor that? And as I say, the feedback we got was that FCA's expectations are perhaps higher than the market had otherwise assumed, and there again a sort of apocryphal remark, or an overheard remark. FCA sort of felt that in general, firms perhaps weren't taking it as seriously as they would have liked, and have not done enough preparation.
Okay, thanks, Abby. And I think we've seen sort of previous focus by them, obviously, and for good reasons, in terms of investment objectives and policies and general disclosures. So I think there's learnings for everyone in the industry. Some more questions that have just come in. Will there be an industry standard template for the SDR consumer-facing disclosure?
I think almost inevitably, but I suspect it won't be produced by FCA. It will be likely to be produced by one of the associations. It's what we've seen with other things, whether it's around target market assessments or other templates. I think it's down to the industry to do that and come up with something that it can then share with the regulator and say, this is what we're proposing to use. FCA do not like determining these sorts of things. They want the market to do it for themselves. I think it's inevitable it will come. There are various, I mean, PIMFA, BVCA, AIMA, all of them have ESG working groups who I think will come together, the IA as well, to produce this. So I think that's going to make life a lot easier if we're all working off a single standard.
No, thank you. Question around of SFDR and SDR. SFDR has a retrospective periodic report in addition to the forward-looking pre-contractual and websites ongoing disclosures. Will there be anything similar for SDR?
Well, there's all of the above. So you've got there's pre-contractual statements on websites, consumer-facing disclosures at the point of marketing, so that covers off the sort of fair, clear, and not misleading. But then, additionally, 12 months down the line from the point that you apply the label, there will also be these ongoing obligations, which, as I said, in terms of the there are consumer-facing ongoing disclosures. There are ongoing disclosures for institutional investors, And then there is the right for the more sophisticated investors to ask for further information on demand. And all of it is around proving, substantiating that you are following the terms of your own strategy, whether that's as a labeled objective or as the initial strategy that you would have disclosed to a retail consumer, where you are not actually going for a label, but you're using these terms. And at the risk of sounding too salesy, is exactly where her team comes into the mix, because he has the ability to collate and clean and make accessible that data in a way that will be, obviously, the institutional investors are more likely to cope with raw data, but with this assumption is that for consumers, that this data will need to be cleaned and made effective and understandable for them to get the clarity of that their investment is what they expected it to be.
Thanks, Abby. And one more sort of online question, then we'll get to some others that we have. Regarding the news about the FCA delaying their policy paper on extending the SDR labels to DFMs, if we can, please could you share this source?
I said the smart money, which I think is sort of a code for undisclosed source. It's i.e. It doesn't make sense that a policy statement can come out even tomorrow, or let alone August, bringing in requirements for December. It just doesn't make, it's unreasonable. So I think it's undisclosed source. There is not a I can't say that there is a definitive source, but conversations have been had, and the likelihood, significant likelihood, is delay.
Okay, thank you. We've obviously covered quite a lot in terms of SDR. SFDR, I suppose a couple of questions. So what are the biggest challenges asset managers are anticipating with the evolving SFDR regulations? Conversely, what opportunities do these changes present? What is the potential impact on non-European asset managers who want to capital raise in Europe?
I think, but personally, I think that the changes, but again, we've got no timeline on those, are a good thing, because they will align to regimes. So you will have similar concepts across funds that are being marketed in the UK and marketed to EU investors. As it is, SFDR and SDR at the moment are not aligned. So I think that's a positive thing in terms of effort and organisation. But obviously change costs money, so people have got used to SFDR, and they will have to put resources on sort of changing their approach. But I think from an investor point of view, the new labels, I think, do provide more clarity. In terms of non-European capital raising, I think, or rather, funds that are looking to from outside Europe to come into Europe for capital raising, I think they do see it as a barrier. I mean, we've done a Corian, I know I've done some recent sort of surveys with North American fund managers who find ESG to be one of the biggest barriers to capital raising, because they're not used to it, because they're worried about litigation, they're worried about lack of clarity, concern for data mining, and as I say, within the States itself, it's a very much a hot topic and a difficult topic. Huge variety of approaches according to whether it's a red state or a blue state. Obviously, with the election coming upon us, it's going to be quite an interesting time for them. So it's another kind of potential barrier for entry. But at the same time, in my experience, a lot of them just went for Article 6 because they didn't want to have to worry about, as I say, their lawyers told them, don't get yourself into this litigation quagmire. And then their investors said, sorry, no can do. We need to have these kite marks, if you like, in order to make the investments. So I think it's an area where they have to come to terms with it, but they do find it very difficult. And we talk to US managers all the time about, you know, what it means and how they could potentially, you know, how they go about proving the SFDR credentials as they are at the moment.
Thanks, Abby. And I think some of it goes back to what you mentioned earlier in terms of the challenges also around, I suppose, the lack of equivalence in the US. So it's not like you're talking the same language, the same requirements in the US for a domestic fund, and then you come into Europe and you think, oh, actually, we've done that before. It's much of the same. Hatim, obviously, you touched on some of the considerations, obviously, from a reporting perspective, you know, some of the drivers in terms of in-house versus sort of external models, so the data, the tech, the staffing. Obviously, this is still evolving, but do you have a view in terms of where the sort of the market's heading in that sort of buy versus build debate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a purely economic perspective, you know, this is a new capability that a lot of the funds have to now bring on board, right? And just you know, just like Ocorion, of course, has built a kind of you know, fairly successful kind of practice on providing a lot of these services, which economically are just much more viable when you have a external service provider who's kind of specialized on them, as opposed to trying to just build everything in-house from scratch, right? So we feel, and really self-serving in that sense, but you know, we feel, of course, that there is the logical thing to do is to work with a partner, you know, that brings in expertise and brings in a lot of the tooling, because obviously the cost of building this tooling for us is spread across our entire client base, versus if somebody has to build this entire tooling in-house, that's something completely, you know, that one person or one fund has to absorb. Maybe it changes if you are a BlackRock, I guess, but you know, for most average humans, I feel it would make sense to work with a partner. And the only times where we have seen that it may not make sense to invest in a tool is if sustainability or ESG is not clearly not going to be part of the roadmap for that firm. And you know, there can be situations where an organization decides that they don't want to be a part of this transition, so be it. Or you know, in a case where they absolutely don't have any clarity on what they want to do yet. And I think in that case, then I would definitely recommend that you speak to somebody like Abby or Bogle to pass it back, because it is important to at least develop a view and build that clarity, right? Because one way or another, this is going to affect the entire industry. There's no escaping it.
Yeah, no, that's useful. And I think it's always that typical challenge of the new regulation or updated regulations and the lead in time, the development time, when you have that sort of in-house model versus an external sort of specialist. So I think, yeah, that's really good feedback. Some additional questions, I think, for sort of both of you that sort of come in. Investor appetite. So really, you know, how do we expect the evolving regulatory landscape to influence investor appetite for sustainable investments in Europe?
Well, I think one has to address the elephant in the room, unfortunately, which is that these sustainable funds haven't done very well performance-wise over the last couple of years. So I think investor appetite has been somewhat dampened by that. But for all that, I think sort of Gen Z will definitely want to have as part of their portfolio. It will become, as Hatim has said, as normal as considering EBITDA. You consider ESG. It'll just be completely inculcated into your investment process. It won't be a special thing. We're at an early-ish. I say that there have been impact funds in the market for 10 plus years, but for a more general basis, we're at an early-ish point. I think it will just become the norm, and investors, especially investors who have any kind of quasi governmental or sort of flavor, certainly in Europe. I mean, some of the Dutch pension funds have been insisting on greenhouse gas emission data reporting for the last sort of 5 years. It's just as this is our requirement. So I think for a long time, a lot of the initiatives have been investor-led, and as long as the investors feel that the regulations appropriately align with their interests, they should be working together. I think obviously the concern is if the big regulations get to the point where they incur so much cost for the fund managers to actually comply that the fees have to go up significantly, then that becomes a stress point, I guess. If you can quantify, because FCA are always obliged to think about the cost impact analysis. If you could if firms as part of their feedback say, okay, we'll do this, but it's going to cost us X, which means fees are going to have to raise by Y. That's something the regulator needs to take on board.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right to raise the sort of the performance elephant in the room. I think, whether you're Gen Z or Gen X, it's going to be that thing that there does need to be that sort of track record, because it just feeds the whole market. If you're an advisor, you have a client or an investor coming to you for funds, it's more of a challenge when most of those funds are in the sort of the lower quartile rather than the upper quartile. So I think that this is almost the latest iteration, but obviously given events the last few years, it's obviously got a global focus, as we're seeing, and certainly at the government level as well. I suppose linking to that in terms of that sort of competitive landscape is, do we think these regulations will create a more level playing field for sustainable investment products, or will they favour certain types of investors or asset managers?
Well, arguably, I think you're either the larger asset management managers, notwithstanding remarks earlier about apparently some of them have not managed to get through FCA's sort of hurdles, but one would imagine that they have the resources to point at this, both from a governance, risk management, data gathering point of view. So they're arguably at an advantage. But I do think it will also benefit the specialist. So I think there will be, if you really specialize in this part of the market, you can put all your resources into it. You can brand. I know SDR is very much about products and services rather than general branding. However, I think branding is important, and if it's quite difficult to have a brand that is all things to all men and women, get my diversity inclusion bit in, because you're trying to sort of position yourself as being able to answer all these potential needs across the market is difficult to do. So I think it may lead to a rise of the specialist. I don't know. I don't know. These are commercials, which I suspect, David, you're more likely to have a view on than I do, or her team actually.
Yeah, no, but just to build on that, what we do see, and the point you made earlier about pension funds in the Netherlands, which is where we are based, requesting information on carbon footprints and things like that. At some level, it just becomes a question of what investor segment is the most important for a fund manager. And if your investor segment is, for example, pension funds, or if you're targeting Gen Z, or if you're targeting another group of investors which just intrinsically looks at these topics seriously, and there's, I think, a fairly substantial set of people who do, including, for example, the government agencies in Europe that provide funding for our private funds, and then there's no escaping it. And then it's pretty much, it's a level playing field because everybody has to deal with the same thing. In fact, there we feel that it's a case for allowing somebody to build a competitive differentiator by doing it well, because actually the opportunity right now is a lot of people are doing it, but not so well. And of course, if you're targeting investors who just don't care, fair enough. Then I guess it's also a question of don't put any label on your fund and just follow the anti-greenwashing rule. Keep it simple.
Thanks, Hatim. We have a couple of final questions, if we can quickly get to those before we sort of wrap up today's session. So the first question is, what are the key things distributors should be doing now?
Well, I think informing themselves of what's out there, who have successfully applied to label, understand what those labels actually mean, so you can align your sales activity with the needs of your clients. So understanding the difference between impact, focus, improvers, and mixed goals. I think it's a really mixed goals. It was a blessing, and I know it was a point that we actually made to the regulator that people don't necessarily just want to have impact assets. They want to be invested in the transition, which is quite an exciting. I mean, the concern of if you don't allow for improvers and transition assets, you're going to starve good companies of capital who are actually going to make a real difference. You're going to narrow the field to such a sort of small group of super green or super social, and you're going to leave the rump behind, struggling for capital, which can't be a good thing. But back to distributors, yes, I think it's just making sure that you're fully informed, and if you have a sort of tame provider who's saying to you, oh yeah, we've got loads of green stuff, don't worry about it, push for more detail, and push for what processes they have to back up. And I think this is the point, going back to what FCA said, it's not just what you say, it's what you do and what you can prove.
Sure, thank you. And one final question. Bespoke portfolios are currently in scope of consultation. What are your views on this being included in the final policy?
Can I be frank? I think it's daft. And I think a lot of others do, because the whole point of bespoke and label do not go together as a concept. Bespoke is exactly that. It's designer. It's designed for individual investor, and by its very virtue, it will be fair, clear, and not misleading, and it will be fulfilling the needs and wants of that particular investor. So applying a label to that does seem peculiar to me. But then if one doesn't go down the label route, and once then subject to the naming and marketing rules, you're going to be pulled in for retail customers for making significant sort of disclosures, which I question whether the investor will even want, because they've not gone and bought something off the shelf, they've designed it. So it's a big question, which I think a lot of firms have wrestled with, and also have made the point to FCA that it doesn't quite fit.
That's great. Thanks, Abby. I suppose we're now to a close. So thank you everyone for participating today, and thank you Abby and her team for your expert and valuable insights. We do hope our webinar has increased your understanding of SDR and SFDR and informed your next steps from a planning and preparedness perspective. We are very happy to discuss where both Newgate and Treaty can help provide solutions for your specific governance and risk management requirements, as well as ESG reporting requirements. Please do fill in this short survey afterwards, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you.